Chapter 4. The First Steps. Even after arriving in Georgia, the walk didn't feel real at all yet. It's like my mind was refusing to believe I was actually going to do the thing I'd been thinking about for so long. I was scared, and along with that, my appetite went away almost completely. Appetite is kind of important when you're burning thousands of calories a day. That was one of my biggest concerns surrounding the trip, losing too much weight and having to go home. Thankfully, my appetite came back sure and strong eventually, and maintaining a somewhat healthy weight wasn't too much of an issue. The morning of day one, I woke up around 5:45 a.m. and got dressed. I had set my pack and other gear out the night before, so I was ready to go. My friend Robbie, who I was staying with, got ready as well before we were picked up by his friend, who took us to North Beach. Day one actually came with less stress than the upcoming days, because all I had to do was walk 20 miles from the beach back to Robbie's house in Savannah. It's still funny to think that this wasn't a very stressful thought, considering I'd never walked 20 miles in one day before. Robbie and his friend walked out onto the beach with me. It was a beautiful sunrise that morning, a deep red glow floating above the waves, calmly crashing onto the sand. I looked out, then stepped into the water. This was it. I had both feet in the Atlantic Ocean. I looked up at Robbie. And I'm not allowed to come home until both of my feet are in the Pacific Ocean, I laughed. Definitely nervous laughter. I felt like an imposter. I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. Only a few miles into my first day, I was walking along the side of a bridge when I spotted a hat out in the road. No, I don't usually seek out random hats lying around, and I didn't pick up any others along the way. But this one stood out. It was all white with an American flag patch sewn on the front. It seemed a little too coincidental to pass up, so I ran out to grab it before stuffing it in my backpack. Once I had made it back to Robbie's house later in the afternoon, we threw it in the washer and had him sign it. This hat would become what I at least think is one of the coolest souvenirs ever. I didn't really keep much else from the trip. Along the entire route, I would ask those I met if they'd like to sign it. I ended up getting too many signatures to count. It is one of my most prized possessions. To be fair, walking across America isn't exactly an innate skill people happen to be born with. However, I felt extra unprepared. I had no prior backpacking experience. I hadn't done all the research that I probably should have, and I didn't take my training all that seriously. The amount of walks I went on back home that I had to dub hangover hikes were too many to count. I quickly found out that this was not going to be easy at all. It was a complete shock on my body, and I knew right then and there that it would be the hardest thing I had ever done. Obviously, I knew it would be difficult going in. I just didn't understand how difficult it would truly be. I definitely wasn't wrong on that one. Within a few hours, I had developed a couple of blisters on my feet and chafing on my thighs. I had walked plenty in my gear, but the humidity of the southeast was something I couldn't have fully prepared for. The humidity would come to be one of my greatest enemies for the first half of the trip. It greatly reduced the amount of miles my body was able to handle walking due to the blistering heat and humidity that lasted 4 or more hours in the afternoon, during which I had to take several shade breaks. I remember sweating constantly. I would sweat throughout the day while I was walking, go to sleep sweating, and wake up in my tent in a pool of sweat. It was insane, weather I was simply not used to. Before I started buying electrolyte mixes for my water, I could drink 2 gallons a day walking and still be very dehydrated. That's how much I was sweating. One of the biggest mistakes I made in calculating the time I'd be on the road was forgetting to factor in weather. In a broad general sense, I did. At least with timing out exactly when I'd be in the desert, so it wouldn't be too dangerously hot. Other than that, I didn't quite consider just how much rain and temperature would affect my day-to-day progress. I'd never spent so much time at the mercy of the elements. The second day of walking was one of the most anxiety-inducing days of my life. I remember waking up at Robbie's house early in the morning, probably around 4 or 5 o'clock. I got my gear together and walked out his front door. He got up to send me off. I remember standing outside his house, saying my goodbyes, and taking those first steps. I felt like those steps leaving Robbie's house were my first real steps. The ones from the beach to his house were safe and predictable. This was my first night where I didn't even know where I was going to sleep. I walked through and out of Savannah in the early morning hours. I had purchased some pepper spray the first day, so I'd feel at least somewhat safe when running into other seemingly sketchy figures wandering the streets at the same time. While obviously there are people out there that do harm to others, I quickly found that I felt very safe in terms of other people for the entirety of the walk. Of course, this was my experience, and I don't doubt my race and gender allowed me privilege in several scenarios. This particular morning I was nervous, but this was my first time walking through a city at such early hours. I had assumed from the beginning that I would feel more comfortable walking through rural areas, which proved to be true. Walking through cities would soon feel much more normal and a little less dangerous. I walked up to some train tracks, and the train was sitting there not moving. Not wanting to climb onto the train, I took the opportunity to drop my heavy pack, weighing somewhere around 20 or 25 pounds at any given point, and take a rest. I quickly hopped onto US Highway 80 shortly after, and continued on there, and would for the coming weeks ahead. Since no one in Savannah wants to talk to an oddly dressed, white compression pants paired with a high visibility construction shirt man using trekking poles to make his way down sidewalks, nobody talked to me for the first day, or the first half of the second day. I had no idea what to expect when it came to the social interaction aspect of the trip. In all honesty, I was originally expecting to just run and gun my way across, figuring no one would have much interest in talking to, let alone helping me. I saw the walk as a goal to complete far more than an adventure to take, though that would change along the way. Before the walk, I would repeatedly refer to it as 100 days of hell that I just need to push through. I'm glad this turned out to not be the case, because I'm not sure I could have handled it. The first person to stop and see what I was up to was a man named Evan. He was on a bike, training for an Ironman. Ambitious for sure, but I had no doubt he could do it. Evan sounded extremely passionate about his training, and was equally intrigued by the prospect of what I was doing. "You're gonna get so skinny, bro," like the times before they had food skinny. He wasn't wrong on that one. After a few shared Forrest Gump references, he moved on. While simple and short, this was one of the most important interactions I had on the trip. Here, I had just met someone on my second day, no more than 30 miles into the journey. He followed my Instagram to keep up with me. It was at that moment I really felt like there was no going back, but in the best, motivating way possible. While I was doing the walk for myself, the support that I was beginning to garner from people I met along the way and on social media served as its own form of motivation. Quitting the walk now wasn't just about letting myself down, but about all of those who were watching. That evening I stealth camped for the first time. Stealth camping is basically just camping anywhere that isn't an established campground. The first time I had heard of the concept was when I met a cycle tourist in 2019. He very casually mentioned that he had just set up his tent off the side of the road at the end of the day. At the time, I was shocked by the concept. How could anyone be comfortable enough to get a good night's sleep right off the side of the highway? Well, here I was 2 years later doing it myself. I don't recall there being any options for motels the first few days of the walk. I figured it'd be better to just throw myself into the whole stealth camping thing anyways. Might as well get used to it. The southeastern states are fairly easy to stealth camp in, as the highways are lined with foliage. My first night camping, I slipped off the road as it was just starting to get dark, made my way some distance from the road, and began pitching my tent. It really wasn't as nerve-wracking as I thought it'd be, at least that first night. I was tucked away behind plenty of foliage and was exhausted. Add in taking some melatonin and I was out pretty quickly. Although there were no issues that night, there would be some concerning camping situations to come for sure. The next morning was rough. I remember feeling exhausted within the first couple of miles. This was in part due to not having a great night's rest, especially having set an alarm for 3:50 a.m. that morning. I pushed through the fatigue and pain the best I could, but there was no denying that the backpacking just wasn't going to work for me. I wanted to be hitting much higher mile days than I was. At this point in time, I was walking in the realm of 20 miles a day. That's certainly a lot, but not enough when you're trying to cross an entire country in less than 100 days. At around 2,600 miles across, I needed to be averaging over 26 miles a day, leaving room for rest days scattered throughout. Although I didn't originally want to deal with the inconvenience while walking through Georgia, I knew I needed to switch from backpacking to pushing a stroller. A jogging stroller is, as far as I have seen, the most popular form of carrying gear in unsupported cross-country treks. Looking at a map, I determined I was still around 30 or so miles from the nearest Walmart along my route. It was going to be hard, but I knew I could make it. As the sun started to come out, it got very hot. And to make matters worse, I ran out of water a few miles from the next gas station that I was planning to fill up at. A few miles doesn't sound like much, but in that heat and humidity, I was needing to drink constantly to replenish the ridiculous amount of water that my body was losing. As much as I didn't want to, I decided to knock on the door of the first house I could find, hoping that somebody would be kind enough to let me fill up a water bottle. Thankfully, at the first house I came across, I ran into a woman named Nancy, who, without hesitation, let me fill up my water. Naturally, conversation ensued, and she actually ended up going inside to grab me some Gatorade powder, as well as some homemade cookies. She recommended a cafe to get lunch at, wished me luck, and I continued on my way. The cafe was only a few more miles away. Once I got there, I was able to charge up my phone and grab a burger to get some needed calories down. I'm pretty confident that I lost most of the weight that I did within the first couple weeks of the walk. The thousands of calories I was burning definitely took my body by surprise. There's no doubt I was excited for day 4. I only had about 13 miles of backpacking left. Then, I'd be able to get a stroller. There was some other gear I'd been interested in picking up as well. Like I said, I really had no idea what I was doing when I stepped off Tybee Island Beach. I certainly didn't have everything that I needed. Even though I hiked quite a few miles over the past couple days, and even though I only had 13 on this day to get to Walmart, I was really struggling with fatigue. I had to take a lot of breaks, which took up a lot more time than that amount of miles should have. Nevertheless, I made it to Walmart and found a jogging stroller that suited my needs, along with other needed items, such as a solar charger. It was such a relief to load my backpack onto that cart. Walking felt much easier without the extra weight putting stress on my back and legs. I eagerly hopped back on the road, making progress west, and feeling a lot more enthusiastic than before. I decided to shorten my route a bit by taking a dirt road as opposed to staying on US 80. While this helped cut down on mileage and provided some rest from the noise of the highway, I found myself in a fairly populated area filled with private properties as the sun was beginning to set. It's fairly common for cross-country trekkers to ask property owners permission to camp on their land, so reluctantly I gave it a shot. After a few polite rejections, I met a man named Mike, who was outside on his driveway. Although he was very understandably, in his words, skeptical of me at first, he very kindly allowed me to pitch my tent on the edge of his property behind some trees. While I was setting up camp, he looked up my Instagram and read about my trip and story. Inspired by this, he came outside and offered me a bag filled with water bottles, snacks, and a couple of gift cards. I was surprised by the gesture. After all, I felt like I'd already asked too much of this man in the first place. This was the first and last time I approached anybody asking to camp on their property. I gladly accepted the trail magic regardless. After checking the weather and seeing that there was a chance of a storm blowing through, I made the poor choice to ignore it and settle in for bed. Not long after, I was rudely awakened by rain flooding my tent. My sleeping bag was supposed to be water resistant, but within mere seconds it was soaked through. I scrambled to take the necessary steps in this situation. I knew my first priority was getting my electronics sealed in the waterproof bag. The only problem was I couldn't find my damn phone. I pulled out my headlamp, frantically shining it around the tent that was continually taking in water. This was the first moment of panic that I experienced on the walk. Panic like this was a feeling I knew I had better learn how to control as unexpected issues arose, but in this instance, my inexperience got the best of me. I was desperately tearing through the tent, pulling up my sleeping bag, running my hands around, hoping to come across my phone. Finally, after what felt like several minutes, I found my phone drenched underneath my sleeping pad. How it got under there, I have no idea. Once it was safely inside my dry bag, I left the tent to take care of the problem of rain getting into my tent. My tent didn't have a built-in rain fly, another mistake on my part. I did have a tarp, however, and quickly draped that over the tent. It wasn't ideal, but it stopped the majority of the water making its way in. This time, however, it was too late. I was soaked, and all my sleeping gear was too. The only thing I had going for me was that it was hot outside, so although I was wet, I at least wouldn't be cold because of it. I curled up and drifted off, hoping to get the best sleep I could, considering the circumstances. It wasn't great, but I managed to get enough rest to make it through the next day. The next morning was the beginning of one of the most important days of the trip. This was the only day that I actually considered quitting the walk. Pretty early for that, huh? I figured that the first few weeks would be the hardest, and in many ways they were, although things never seemed to get any easier at the same time. I woke up soaked, my skin wrinkled. I was a little cold, so I reached for my hoodie. That was soaked through as well. There wasn't anything I could do about it, so I went ahead and got out of my tent, packed everything up. Though discouraged, I found comfort in the condition of the dirt road. I had feared that it might be very muddy, making pushing the cart difficult. Thankfully, this wasn't the case, and I was able to make my way back to US 80 in a matter of an hour or two. Very soon after, I experienced one of the most concerning issues of the entire trip. My phone had been stored away in my dry bag, but at some point I got it out to double-check directions. The only problem? It appeared to be shutting off as soon as it booted. Just my luck, I thought. After all, the last couple of phones I've gone through had similar endings. Panic set in quickly, as I had been notifying my family of my whereabouts fairly consistently. I hated the thought of them not knowing where I was and being left to wonder if I was okay. Especially my sister. We both get really anxious about our loved ones. Wanting to get that anxiety out of the way, I stopped at the first gas station I saw and asked the cashier if I could make a phone call to my sister. This request was rejected, so I kept walking while keeping an eye out for any potential opportunities to borrow a phone. I was hoping someone would stop to talk to me, as had been happening constantly for the past few days, in hopes that I could borrow their phone. Unfortunately, no one stopped that morning. I did, however, come across a business on the side of the road. There was a man outside who I approached and politely asked if I could borrow a phone, offering to trade my wallet so he knew I wasn't trying to steal. Hesitantly, he offered up his phone. I felt bad, so I made a couple calls as quickly as possible. Once my family knew my situation, I was a lot less anxious. I still had the issue of the phone to sort out, however, and I assumed I'd need to buy a new phone. This was so frustrating because I had spent $500 on my current phone just a couple weeks prior. Financial concerns surrounding the trip became overwhelming, and the thought of quitting became a real possibility. After all, if I was going to have to drop several hundred more dollars within only the first week, who knows how much else I might have to spend throughout the remaining duration. I had plenty of money saved, but not enough to keep up at this rate. Now this is the part that's going to make me look really dumb. However, I'm not censoring any aspects of the walk. My phone was just fine. Some setting I had accidentally turned on or had already been on caused my screen brightness to automatically lower when exposed to sunlight. It made the screen appear black. I'm not sure what the benefit of this feature is. I think it was an awful idea, but I'm just glad I was able to figure it out. I was using a phone in a city hall in a small town when I pulled out my phone and noticed it turn right on. The dimmer light in the building caused the screen brightness to go back up on its own. This was a huge relief, and to add to these positive feelings, the employee present at the city hall offered some cold drinks when she found out what I was doing. I sat outside in the shade, resting both my body and jittery nerves for a while. I had walked a fair distance in a short amount of time, encompassed by my anxiety regarding the phone situation. I always feel like I get a lot more done when I'm anxious, so my progress made sense. I noticed a storm brewing again, so I hit the road in hopes of beating it and finding a campsite for the night. This didn't go as planned, and I found out that my rain jacket wasn't nearly as waterproof as I thought it was. In fact, it didn't seem to be very waterproof at all. There seems to be a common theme of my gear failing throughout this journey. Wardrobe malfunctions, flat tires, waterproof gear that wasn't so waterproof, you name it. This type of travel was really outside the likeness of anything I had ever done before, and my inexperience really showed itself through the choices I made when it came to buying gear. I probably should have done more research or consulted someone more knowledgeable in the area. There's a lot of things I probably should have done, but I believe it was better for me to start unprepared rather than not having started at all. I couldn't have ever been fully prepared for this. Too many unknown factors came into play along the way. Besides, every little thing I could have taken time to try and be ready for would have only served as excuses to further push off this dream of mine. The sixth day of the walk was much better than the last, and I continued to experience quite a lot of Southern hospitality. In the coming weeks, I would discuss this Southern hospitality notion with former cross-country trekker Mark Dudek, whom I had met through social media. He and I both had no idea what to expect when it came to how we would be treated along the way. It was amusing to find out that he wasn't expecting to experience the same generosity as other walkers before, because he didn't feel like he had an outgoing enough personality. What I found to be ironic was that I felt the same way when comparing myself to Dudek. I don't consider myself to be the most outgoing person, but that didn't seem to affect the support I received along the way. It all started early in the morning while I was doing some quick grocery shopping in a Walmart. I had left my stroller out front while I was inside, and when I was leaving the store, a woman named Brenda came up to talk to me. She asked about what I was doing, then proceeded to offer money. This caught me a bit off guard, as I had intended to self-fund the trip. I told her I didn't really need it, but would gladly accept the help. This was an important lesson from the journey. People want to be a part of something. I firmly believe it wouldn't have done anyone any good if I had turned down offers along the way. Every time I accepted help, I found the journey became that much bigger than myself. Brenda signed my hat, and I continued on my way. Just a few hours later, I encountered one of the kindest and most unforgettable encounters of the trip. I was making my way along US Highway 80 when a man named Bob pulled over. Like everyone else, he asked what I was doing. He was absolutely shocked. I have no idea why the hell you're doing that, but I respect it. We chatted for a few minutes before he left. He was back just a few minutes later, however. Bob brought me some water and snacks. I still have no idea why the hell you're doing this, and I know we just met, but my house is right up the road if you want to rest for a minute. I hadn't been inside anyone's home for any extended period of time for days, so of course I couldn't pass it up. This is probably the part where people are going to start questioning if I had any personal safety protocols. Some of the things I did along the way broke every rule they taught us in kindergarten, right down to don't take candy from strangers. I definitely did that a few times. There was a lot of concern when close ones found out I had accepted an invitation into a stranger's home. I did what I could to make it as safe as possible. First, I had my pepper spray. Second, I was able to mark the location of the house on Life 360. Realistically, if someone really wanted to do me harm, it could have happened. But I mean it when I say I never felt truly threatened by anyone along the way. There's a certain kind of vulnerability that comes with the walk. Some current and former cross-country trekkers I've talked to absolutely loved having that experience. I still don't know how I feel about it, but I do think I've learned to be more open and trusting of others. Most people are well-intentioned, though the fear of a few that aren't was an occasional thought. Bob's house was the opposite of danger. He let me take a shower, which felt incredible after 5 days stuck in a never-ending cycle of sweating, and made me a sandwich for lunch. We had time to sit down and talk while I ate, but I had to get to the next town that afternoon. I thanked him for all that he had done and got back on the road. Not long after I was back on the highway, a woman named Haley pulled over. She was a reporter for the Crossroad Chronicle, the Greater Swainsboro area paper. Bob had called in and left a tip. It was a fairly quick interview, but conducted so well and honestly. I appreciated the opportunity to share my story. I wanted to be heard. And honestly, who wouldn't want to have an article written about him? It was fun. Like I said, it was a fairly quick interview. She snapped a photo of me in my stroller, and then we parted ways. I figured I'd take a shot at finding a more established place to sleep for the night, so I used the common trekking technique of calling the local non-emergency police number of the town that I was heading toward, Adrian, Georgia. I had learned about calling towns ahead of time while listening to a podcast about Mark Dudek's Walk Across America. And although I wouldn't end up doing it too much, it did come in handy a few times. The operator ended up being quite helpful and was able to get back to me with a couple of options, one of those being Camp Adrian. I figured a summer camp might be willing to let someone pitch their tent for the night. Worst thing they could say is no, after all. I called and ended up talking with their director. He was an extremely kind man and gladly offered me a place to stay for the night. Finally, a place I could pitch my tent without a fear of being disturbed. While it was a fair amount of distance to cover with not much time, it ended up being well worth it. When I arrived, I met Jeff, the director. We spent time conversing about my walk. After all, it's a pretty great icebreaker, even to this day. After he asked about my previous camping arrangements and we talked about the lack of showers, he looked at me and said, "Well, you're gonna have a shower tonight. And air conditioning." To my surprise, he invited me inside the main office and brought out a key. I really thought I'd just be pitching my tent out somewhere, but instead I was given a map and told how to get to a cabin. Turns out, another man walking across the country a few years prior had called them as well. Jeff expressed that he was more than happy to help out, especially because of that previous experience. I made the short walk across the campground and found my cabin. Opening the door, I was greeted with the sight of what looked like a motel room. A nice bed, bathroom area, desk, and an air conditioning unit. I'm not sure any words could quite explain what it was like to hop back in a bed for the first time in a week, but I will say I had never laughed with joy after getting in a bed until this moment. On the 7th day of the walk, I was making my way through Dublin, Georgia, when I heard someone shout my name from behind. I ignored it at first, because who would know me out there? They called it again. "Hey, Andrew." I turned around and saw Mike from the other day, whose property I had slept on. It took me a minute to put it all together. I was confused to say the least. Turns out he felt compelled to come find me and help out with the trip. Mike didn't have my contact info and didn't know my exact route, but made the 50 or so mile drive regardless, hoping he might find me. He handed me an envelope with some money, then asked if I was hungry. Perfect timing. I was right about to head into a Subway. We sat down and had lunch together for an hour. I was able to hear more about his family and career. Career was a big talking point, especially considering where I was at in life. An insecurity I dealt with on the walk was feeling like I was being irresponsible. Having somebody successful and further along in life support what I was doing so heavily solidified the idea that I was doing the right thing for myself. I hadn't sat down for a whole meal with someone else for a week at that point, one of those little things that matters a lot more once you go without it. It felt nice to be heard. While there was a part of me that wanted to keep to myself throughout the walk, admittedly, there was equally as much of a part of me that wanted to be heard, to be able to share my story. As if Mike hadn't done enough for me at that point, he helped me get set up at a motel in town, paying for it as well. We grabbed a picture together, then said our goodbyes. He kept up with me throughout the remainder of the walk, and to this day, we're still in touch. I decided it was finally time to take a 0 day. Different muscles throughout my legs and feet took turns hurting every day. I was exhausted, and the repetitive nature of what I was doing had me drained mentally. I still wasn't used to this lifestyle yet. I decided that I would start taking off days every 8th day. Admittedly, this concept went down the drain very quickly. I didn't take nearly enough 0 days throughout the journey. 5 or 6 throughout those 98 days. Maybe that's why my feet still hurt. After sleeping in for a bit and watching a couple episodes of SpongeBob, I walked over to a nearby Dollar General, where I was able to pick up a lot of snacks and some supplies. 0 days were a lot of fun when I was near a store that sold food. I'd experienced the same level of hunger as I had in days prior, only this time I had all day to eat literally as much as I wanted. Each day of the first week was so memorable. I was new to this, making even the slightest variation in events seemingly worthwhile to write about. As the walk continued, I found a rhythm to my days, causing them to blur together.